Oi, are you looking for an opening that is solid yet dangerous? Or are you perhaps bored of the sometimes too repetitive London system? Well, the solution is the Queen's Gambit, and without further ado, let's dive right in. To play the Queen's Gambit, we start with the move d4, and me the move d5 with the move c4, immediately putting pressure on the pawn on d5 and offering a sacrifice of the pawn on c4. So now the question is, what happens if black takes on c4? Well, we wanted to provoke black to play this move, because now we will simply play the move e3, and our idea is that after we take the pawn on c4, we will have 2v1 advantage in a center. So now black's most logical reaction is to obviously protect the pawn on c4, but if black goes b5, it is already a mistake and we can set a very nasty trap. Now we will simply play the move a4, trying to undermine this pawn chain, and the question is how black responds. Well, it seems that c6 is the only way of how to keep that pawn chain together, because if black plays the move a6, we will just simply take on b5, and after black recaptures, we will take the rook. So that doesn't work. If black takes on a4, we will just simply recapture with our queen, check, and then we will win the pawn back once again, and once again we have this 2v1 advantage in the center. So what about the c6 move? The c6 seems to be the most logical, right? However, it doesn't work. We will just simply take on b5, and after our opponent recaptures with a c-pawn, here we go, queen f3, double exclamation mark, hitting the rook, and there is no way how to save the rook. Oh, well, there is one way of how to save the rook, but it involves the sacrifice of the knight. So after black plays the move knight c6, which is the only move in the position that is not losing the rook, we'll just simply take the knight, and now after black goes bishop d7, we will drop our queen back to e4, and we are already piece up. Now you might be asking yourself, what happens if black doesn't play the move b5 and plays something like knight f6 instead? Well, either way, it's good news for us. Now we will just simply recapture the pawn that we sacrificed, and we have 2e1 in the center. And why is it so relevant? Well, it is relevant because the pawn on d5 is gone, and that was the best pawn in black's position. Now we will just simply get a control over a lot of space and over the entire center. Black will play something like e6, just planning to develop the dark squared bishop. We can play knight f3, black goes bishop b4 with a check. Okay, we can just simply play knight c3, block the check. And after something like short castle, what we're planning to do is to play e4 and have this ideal pawn formation in the center. Also, what we can always do is to play, let's say, after something like knight c6, we can play the move a3. And after bishop takes c3, we just simply recapture with our pawn. And now it is even better, because we have actually 3v1 in the center. Because black's knight is blocking the pawn on c7, and that's a big problem for black. What we are planning to do is still the same thing. We will just simply drop the bishop back to d3, and then we will go e4, and we will have the ideal pawn center. We can also play something like e5 later on with ideas like bishop takes h7 that we will talk about, or just simply bishop d3, bishop b2, c4, and then d5, potentially opening up both of the diagonals for our bishop pair. Well, what happens if black doesn't take on c4? What if black knows how to handle this position? What if black plays something like knight f6, protecting the pawn? Well, it is not a secret that knight f6 is not a great move, and it is definitely not the best way of how to deal with the c4 move. It is better to play something like e6 or c6, protecting the pawn on d5 that we will cover in a minute. But let's have a look at the move knight f6 first. Why is it so bad? Why is it bad to protect the pawn on d5? Well, it doesn't really matter whether you protect the pawn with a queen or with a knight or whatever you want to recapture with. What we can always do is to take and get the 2v1 in the center, and then attack the piece and get the ideal pawn formation in the center. So let's say I go c takes d5. You retake with the queen, I go knight c3. Hit the queen, and my next move will be e4, just having the ideal pawn center. And also being tempo up, right? So what if black takes with the knight instead? Well, if black takes with the knight, you guessed it right, it's the move e4. Once again, we have this ideal pawn center. We are playing the move with a tempo as well, which is amazing. And we are already much better in this position. Let's say black goes knight f6, which is the most common move, and we go knight c3. Now there is a very interesting line for white, much more interesting for white than for black, which is the move knight c6, and it is very common mistake below 1500. I believe that it is actually the most common move in this position, which is really surprising. And now I will show you an amazing line that involves a queen sacrifice. We will go knight f3. Keep in mind that you can also play the move d5 if you don't like the idea of sacrificing your queen, and that's also a really good move. But I will show you the move knight f3, and now let's say black goes bishop g4. Pin in the knight, put in some pressure on the pawn on d4. Makes sense, right? We will take on f3, we will take on d4. That will be great. Well, not on my watch. I will just simply play the move d5, hit the knight, and what is black planning to do? Knight e5 is already losing because of the queen sacrifice, but first of all, let's have a look what happens if black finds the bishop takes f3 move, which is the best move in the position. However, white's position is already so much better. We just simply recapture with our g-pawn, and now the knight is still hanging. But look at white's control over the center. This is just simply amazing. If black goes something like knight e5, we will improve it even more. We can play the move f4, hitting the knight with a tempo. Let's say black goes knight g4, we play e5. Now the knight needs to move, we will win the knight on g4. Let's say black goes knight c4, we win the knight. So black needs to go knight d7, and then we go e5. And this is the final move of our line, because look at that. You have so much space. Let's flip the board. Oh my god, if black is claustrophobic, he's definitely going to pass out right now. Black definitely can't play this line. But, well, sort of has to, right? That's what I said. That if black doesn't take on f3, white is actually winning. So let's have a look at what happens after the move knight e5. Now we sacrifice our queen. Look at that. Taking the knight. What is going on? Well, black probably has to accept the sacrifice, right? Because otherwise we just won the knight on e5. So black needs to go for bishop takes d1. But now we go bishop b5 check. And what should black do in this position? Black can block with the knight. Black can block with the pawn. But neither of these lines is actually working. Let's have a look at knight d7 first. After knight e7, we take with the bishop, and now it is almost a checkmate. So black has to recapture with the queen, and then we will take the queen. After king takes d7, we won the material back, but we can also win the bishop on d1, and now what? We are piece up, ladies and gentlemen. This is absolutely winning position. What else can black do in this position? Well, the move c6 seems to be the most logical, right? Blocking the check, hitting the bishop, but now we take on c6 with our pawn. And our idea is that we will either play the move c7 with a check, hitting the queen on d8, or c takes b7 with a check once again, and then planning to promote. So let's say black goes something like queen c7, trying to block the square c7, so we can't play c7 check. We will take on b7, and if black blocks with something like the knight, for example, knight d7, we will take on a8. We can actually turn that pawn into a rook with a check, under promoting the pawn, and after queen b8, black is claiming, well, I'm protecting the queen, so I'm absolutely fine. No, you're not. Rook takes b8 is the move, and it is a checkmate. Game over. So if we go back to the position where black played queen c7, what else can black do? For instance, if black plays something like e6, we will just simply play the move c7 check, and now we are going to win the queen back. After king e7, we will promote and win the queen, and then we can just simply win the bishop, and now we are what? We are 2 pieces up. So this is absolutely brilliant queen sacrifice, knight takes e5. Remember that a lot of players will fall for this trick, and yeah, you can basically beat your opponent in below 12 moves. But what happens if our opponent knows this trap and knows the theory? Well, in that case, I have you covered. But don't worry, it will also involve a trap. So let's have a look at the move e6. Simply planning to develop the dark squared bishop and then castle short. That seems to be the most logical move in this position. So now we will just carry on with our development. We will just play the move knight f3, knights first. And then after the move bishop b4, which is also a really logical move, pinning the knight, hitting the pawn on e4, we will play the move bishop d3, protecting the pawn on e4, but also, this is the most active square for our bishop. It doesn't seem like it at the moment because the bishop is blocked by the pawn on e4. But you will see what is our trap. Our trap that we set for our opponent is that if black plays short castle, which is the most logical move, we will play really nice e5, opening up the diagonal for the bishop. And if our opponent jumps to d5 with their knight, and quite frankly they don't really have anything else in this position, we will sacrifice the bishop on h7. And now what should black do? Well, black should probably accept the sacrifice. Because if black doesn't accept the sacrifice, then after king h8, knight g5, it's basically going to be the same thing as what we will play in the game. Just worse because black lost the chance to win the bishop. At least something, right? So let's say black takes on h7, and we will play the move knight g5 with a check. And now what should black do? It seems that the most logical move in this position is to play the move king g8, trying to save the king. However, this is already over, guys. This is over. This is done. This is toast. Black can resign because we will play the move queen h5, threatening the checkmate on h7. And now what should black do? What should black do? Well, the best move is actually to sacrifice the queen. And if that's the best move, then the position is really, really bad, right? Well, let's have a look at the move rook e8, which is probably, perhaps, the most tricky move that black can play in this position, trying to escape with the king. However, we are not going to play queen h7, king f8, queen h8, king e7, queen takes g7. No, we're not going to go for it. We saw your trap, and we called your bluff. We're not going to play this move, because we will take on f7 first. And after queen takes f7, king h8, now we go back with our queen. And after king g8, the pawn on f7 is gone. Otherwise, it's the same position. So what we can do is just simply play queen h7, king f8, queen h8, king e7, and queen takes g7. Checkmate. Game over. So as you can see, if black goes back to g8, it is really bad. So what else could black do? Is there anything that black could do in this position? I mean, king h6 doesn't really work, because then we just simply take on f7 with our knight, check, hitting the queen, but it is also a discover check. So no rook takes f7 for you. You can't play that move. It is illegal, and we will just simply win the queen. So the only other move that black can play is king g6, because king h8 would run into queen h5 and queen h7 checkmate in the next move. So after king g6, we will play the move h4. That's the last move you need to remember, the last idea. Because now we're planning to play the move h5 and force black to go to h6, and then knight takes f7 is winning the queen once again. And, well, what would happen if, let's say, black played the move king f5 instead of king h6? In this case, you're going to deliver a checkmate with a pawn g4. Look at that. What a beautiful checkmate. So this is definitely a line that black should avoid, but I mean, where did black go wrong? Black just developed all of the pieces, castled, and then boom, game over. So far we've gone over d takes c4 and knight f6, and we've destroyed them all. What should black do? What should I do? I mean, whenever I come up with something, some sort of an idea, why it just destroys me? Yeah, that's exactly how your opponents are going to sound like. And they have to know a little bit more to be able to be competitive, to be able to actually stay in the game. But even after that, you will be better. So what are the other moves that black can play? D takes c4 doesn't work, knight f6 doesn't work, so what else? Well, now one of the most common moves is the move c6, aka the Slav defense. The idea of the move c6 is just simply protecting the pawn on d5, which is the same idea as e6, protecting the pawn on d5 with a pawn. However, each of these options has its own pros and cons. The move c6 is blocking the c6 square for the knight, which is a problem. On the other hand, it keeps this diagonal c8, h3 open for the bishop. On the other hand, it is not opening up the diagonal for the other bishop, so the development is a little bit slower. So as you can see, both of these lines are perfectly playable. E6 is a little bit more common on the Grandmaster's level. However, c6 is really good. c6 is very solid, but I will show you how to crack it. So now what we will do, we will just simply develop our knight. That's our standard setup. Then we will develop the other knight. Knights first. And now the question is, what is black going to play? If black plays something like e6, we will just play a very standard setup with bishop g5. That's something you will also see against the Queen's Gambit declined. And let's say black just breaks the pin. Now we are happy that the bishop is out, so we can play the move e3. Now the bishop is no longer locked in. And let's say after short castle, we will just simply play bishop d3. And our plan is to play short castle. So knight c3, knight f3, bishop g5, e3, bishop d3, short castle. That's something we want to do all the time. And if, let's say, black goes something like knight e7, we'll play short castle and black takes on c4, also known as the Marin idea. Well, we just simply take, and if our opponent goes b5, we will say, okay, this is a little bit annoying. You're putting some pressure on us, but we still have the center. We still have the 2e1. So we're just gonna play bishop d3, and then we will play e4 and have this ideal pawn structure in the center. Maybe we can also play e5 later on, and perhaps some ideas like bishop takes h7 we've already gone over. So that's if your opponent goes the move e6, which is called the semi-Slav. It is just the semi-Slav because it is closing down the diagonal for the bishop, so it's somewhere between of the Slav and the Queen's Gambit decline. Now let's have a look at the move e6, aka the main line, aka the Queen's Gambit decline, aka the best opening against the Queen's Gambit in my honest opinion, aka something I wouldn't play against Magnus. The move e6, opening up the diagonal for the bishop, playing it solidly. Well, now we just play knight c3. As always, we react in the same way, you know. First of all, developing the queenside knight, then the other knight, and then we want to play bishop g5. And we will talk about it more later. But first of all, let's have a look at the move d takes c4. Well, d takes c4 doesn't work that well here. We will just simply play e4 and then we will win the pawn back. So this is fine. This is already the same idea as we've already talked about. So let's go back to this position and let's have a look at the move knight f6. Now we go knight f3, and before having a look at the main line, which is the move bishop e7, and then just simply casting short, which is the main line for a reason, because it is the most solid way of how to play the Queen's Gambit decline, let's have a look at other alternatives. Let's have a look at, for example, c6. I'm sure you recognize that this is the semi-Slav. We will just simply play bishop g5, e3, bishop d3, short castle, win. Win. That's it. That's the plan. So let's go back. Let's have a look at a different move. A different move that I think is very important to cover because it is the most common mistake in the Queen's Gambit below 1500. That's the move knight c6. Now you might be asking yourself, why is knight c6 a mistake? Well, it is a mistake because it is blocking the pawn on c7. The pawn on c7 would like to get involved, would like to go c6, c5, would like to go places, would like to do something, contribute to something, and die as a happy pawn that achieved something in its life, not just wasting its own life on the square c7. And now you might be asking yourself, why is there such an obsession with this c4 or c5 or c6? Maybe you're playing e4, e5 and you don't play f4 and you're doing just fine. And well, that's perfectly fine because e4, e5 is not an equivalent of d4, d5 because the position of the king and the queen is switched. So, well, if we go f4 here, our opponent can, for example, play bishop c5 and stop us from castling. Or can take and then play queen h4 check and put pressure on the king that will lose the castling rights. Whereas if we go d4, d5, c4, then bishop f5 is something that would even remotely concern us, because we are not planning to castle long anyways. And king a4, that's some illegal stuff, you know. That's something. Do you remember this episode where Walt went to a4 and well, I was referencing Breaking Bad. I don't know if you guys ever watched it, but it is a great series. But anyways, this is just not the same, you know. d4, d5, c4. It's not the same as e4, e5, f4. And the c pawn has to get much more involved in the fight for the center than the pawn on the f-file in e4, e5 openings. So that's exactly the reason why the knight just simply does not belong on c6. And it is really bad there. Also, you know, it is only controlling squares that are already covered by our pieces. So that knight is just a really bad piece. And what we're going to do, we're just simply planning to play bishop g5 anyways, you know, as usual. And after bishop e7, we will play e3, short castle. And if you remember our strategy, it was bishop d3, d takes, short castle, win. That was it. Do you remember it? Now you will. So here we are, the main line. And now you will play bishop g5, e3, bishop d3, short castle. I'm just kidding, guys. I know I already said it a bunch of times, just so you remember it better. That was exactly the aim. So yeah, now you know that we will want to play the same setup as usual. Now what should black do? Black should probably castle short. And after black castle short, we will play the move e3. Yeah, that's in line with what we always want to play. Protecting the pawn on c4, preparing to develop our bishop. And now let's say knight c6 would transpose into the line where the pawn on c7 was quite sad. The line c6 would transpose into the semi-Slav. So there are two other moves that I would like to go over. Knight e7 and c5. And well, if you remember, I said about this pawn that that pawn wants to go places, you know, experience some stuff in the life, perhaps experiment a little bit. Yeah, definitely doesn't want to stay in its hometown on c7, but wants to travel. So now the pawn traveled to c5. And now what should we do? Well, in this structure, we always want to take on d5. We always want to do this first. And it is really good for us that it is white to move. Because since it's white to move, we can decide whether we will play with the isolated queen's pawn or against the isolated queen's pawn. And I think that you would prefer playing against the isolated queen's pawn. So let's take on d5. And after black takes with the e pawn, we will just simply take on c5. Now after bishop takes c5, we just get into a position with the IQP, isolated queen's pawn structure. Which is not really good for black at the moment. We will talk about it a little bit more at the end of the video. But here, black loses that pawn immediately, right? We will just simply take, black takes, and we win the pawn. And we are already pawn up. So this is amazing. So let's say black goes the knight d7, and we play bishop d3, and black plays c5. c6 would be the semi-Slav once again. And now we just simply take, our opponent takes, we take on c5, our opponent takes, and we castle short. And as always, we don't mind playing against the IQP. But now there are a few things that you need to remember about this pawn structure. First of all, the advantage of having the IQP is that black has quite easy development. Because the pieces are not blocked by any pawns, that means that, you know, this bishop can develop easily, this bishop can develop easily, and black doesn't struggle with the development at all because there are no pawns on the c and e files. Yeah, well, there is one pawn on the d file, but yeah, that's actually not that important. It's not stopping black from, for example, developing the light square bishop. So that's what you need to know about black's plan. Black wants to play for the initiative and an attack because, you know, black just has, you know, slightly easier development because there are no pawns that would be blocking their own pieces. However, this pawn is still weakness. And the more pieces we will exchange, the weaker it will be. So what we are planning to do, we are planning to double up on the d file. So we would like to play something like queen d2, rook d1. Then perhaps move the bishop, attack the pawn on d5. And we always need to make sure that our opponent's pawn can't move, because otherwise black would be more than happy to exchange the pawn. But now we have the knight on f3 and the pawn on e3, so it's not possible. And yeah, whenever we can exchange, we don't really mind it. We don't mind transposing into an endgame, because once we transpose into an endgame, we'll be able to win the pawn on d5 and win the game. But even if you don't be too scared of black's play. The attack is not that strong. And also, it doesn't mean that you can't start attacking black at some point. But generally, this is what you need to know. You don't mind exchanging pieces because you're playing against this fixed weakness on d5. And you always have to keep an eye on that pawn. You can never let your opponent play something like d4. That's it. This was a crash course on the IQP, and now you know how to handle it. Alright guys, today's video is over, and if you want to get better in the Queen's Gambit, make sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons.